Judge underestimates teen, but the teen is actually a legal genius in disguise. The courtroom was buzzing with tension, the air thick with the anticipation of yet another case that was sure to drag on for hours. At the center of the room sat a young teenager, no older than 16, with his eyes focused on the polished surface of the oak table in front of him. His name was Ethan Blake, a quiet, unassuming boy with a mop of messy brown hair and glasses that seemed a bit too big for his face. Dressed in a suit that appeared to have been borrowed from an older sibling, he looked every bit the part of a nervous high school student, unsure of what was to come. But the seasoned judge, Judge Amanda Donovan, didn't seem to notice or care about the subtle hints of discomfort. She was a woman who had seen it all, tough, no nonsense, and well respected in her courtroom. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, swept across the room with an air of superiority. She glanced briefly at Ethan, but quickly dismissed him with a skeptical glance. After all, why would anyone take a teenager seriously in a legal setting? "Mr. Blake," Judge Donovan began, her voice loud and authoritative, "you stand accused of defying court orders and disrupting the proceedings of a legal case. How do you plead?" Ethan's heart raced. He had never been in a courtroom before, much less been the defendant. The thought of defending himself against the accusations in front of the entire room made him sweat, but he had no choice. His hands trembled as he adjusted his glasses and stood, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Judge Donovan's lips curled into a smirk. "Not guilty?" she repeated, as if the words themselves were foreign to her. "You're a teenager, Mr. Blake. You have no idea what you're up against." The room fell silent. The judge's words hung in the air like a challenge, daring Ethan to prove her wrong. The prosecution, a sharp-suited lawyer with a booming voice, stood and snickered quietly to himself, clearly confident in the outcome of the trial. "You've clearly never dealt with a case like this before, kid," the prosecutor said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "This is the big leagues. I suggest you sit down and let the adults handle it." Ethan's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say a word. The judge's words, though condescending, had sparked something deep within him, a fire he had been hiding for years. The world saw him as just another teenager, another face in the crowd. But in reality, Ethan Blake was far from ordinary. He wasn't just any student. He was a legal prodigy. Growing up, Ethan had devoured every law book he could get his hands on. His fascination with the intricacies of the law began at a young age, and by the time he was 14, he was already studying cases that law students struggled to understand. His knowledge was vast, and his ability to analyze legal arguments was beyond his years. But he kept it hidden, his genius buried under the facade of a quiet, awkward teenager. No one knew the truth about him. No one except his mother, who had always supported his dreams. As the case proceeded, the judge continued to underestimate him, her comments dripping with mockery. "You really think you can argue this case yourself, Mr. Blake? This isn't some high school debate. This is the real world, and you'll quickly learn that you don't get to just decide how things go here." Ethan stood tall, his mind racing. He had to act fast. He couldn't let her continue to mock him. This was his moment to prove, not just to Judge Donovan, but to everyone in the courtroom, that he was more than just a teenager. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice now steady, "I ask that you allow me to present my argument. I have studied this case extensively and believe there has been a misunderstanding." Judge Donovan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, this should be good," she muttered, almost to herself, but loud enough for everyone to hear. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Ethan to fail. But instead of faltering, Ethan opened the case file in front of him, his fingers flipping through the pages with ease. He didn't just glance at the file. He knew it by heart. He had anticipated this moment for years, and now that it had arrived, he was ready. "Your Honor," Ethan began again, his voice now commanding the room's attention. "The core of this case revolves around a misinterpretation of legal precedent. The law clearly states that—" But before he could finish, Judge Donovan interrupted, her voice tinged with amusement. "Oh, really? And what law would that be, Mr. Blake? The one that you've apparently learned from a book?" Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled inwardly, knowing that the judge had just played right into his hands. "I'm referring to the State versus Ford case, which establishes a precedent that—" The judge's face went from amused to suddenly serious. She knew that case. In fact, it was one of the most complicated legal rulings in recent years. one that only the most experienced lawyers and law students could grasp. The entire courtroom went silent. The prosecutor's confident smirk faded, and even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's words were precise, his knowledge flawless. He had laid the foundation of his argument, and there was no turning back now. The silence in the courtroom was almost suffocating. Judge Donovan, who had been so sure of her control over the situation, now found herself on the defensive. Her eyes flickered between the pages of the case file Ethan had referenced, her expression tightening as she realized that the teenager standing before her was no ordinary defendant. His knowledge of legal precedents, his understanding of the finer details of the case, he wasn't just parroting words from a textbook. He was operating on a level that far surpassed anyone's expectations. Ethan continued, unshaken by the tension in the room. The Ford case, he repeated, clearly stipulates that a legal argument cannot be dismissed simply because one party is a minor. In fact, the precedent has been set that minors who demonstrate a certain level of legal understanding and maturity are entitled to present their arguments in court, especially when they are in possession of irrefutable facts. Judge Donovan looked at him, her brow furrowed. She hadn't anticipated this. A wave of doubt began to creep in. Was this teen really as clueless as she had assumed, or was she in over her head? Her fingers drummed on the edge of the gavel, but she held back from speaking, letting Ethan continue. Ethan's voice grew more confident as he delved deeper into his argument. Your Honor, I understand that this is highly unusual, but this case hinges on the interpretation of certain contracts that were made with my mother. The prosecution claims I violated a court order, but if you carefully review the correspondence between us, you will find that I was within my rights to take the actions I did. The judge opened her mouth to speak, but Ethan held up a hand. I ask that you consider the documents I've provided in support of my case. These are not just legal papers. They are proof that the prosecution has misrepresented the facts in several key areas. If you take a closer look at Exhibit B, Ethan's finger pointed to the document that was now on the table. You'll see a clause that was omitted intentionally, and it's this clause that absolves me of any wrongdoing. Judge Donovan's gaze snapped to the document he referenced. Her eyes scanned the fine print, and she felt the weight of his argument sinking in. She was no longer dealing with a nervous, inexperienced teenager. This boy was a walking, talking legal encyclopedia. The sudden realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The prosecutor, who had been smugly watching from his desk, now stood up. Abruptly. Your Honor, he interjected, his voice rising in both disbelief and frustration. This is a joke. A teenager shouldn't be allowed to manipulate the law like this. What's next? Are we going to allow kids to become lawyers at 15? But Ethan wasn't fazed. He turned to face the prosecutor directly, his eyes locking with the man's. I didn't manipulate anything. I simply applied the law as it was, meant to be applied. You should have done your homework before accusing someone of breaking it. The prosecutor opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. He had been caught in his own game, his own arrogance laid bare by a teenager he had underestimated. He had thought Ethan would crumble under the pressure, but instead the teen had turned the tables, dissecting the case with a calm precision. That left him scrambling. Judge Donovan cleared her throat, bringing the room back to order. Mr. Blake, she said, her voice more subdued now, but still carrying authority. I must admit I underestimated you, but this is still highly irregular. I've never seen a case like this before, and you're asking me to break from traditional protocols. Why should I believe that a 16-year-old can handle this level of responsibility? Ethan looked at her, and for the first time his expression softened. He wasn't just a teenager. He was a person with a deep, unshakable belief in justice. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady, the law is meant to be impartial. It doesn't discriminate based on age or appearance. It is not my age that should concern you, but my ability to present the facts clearly and without bias. The law is universal. It's not about who I am, but about what is right. The room fell into a deep silence once again, as the weight of his words resonated throughout the courtroom. Judge Donovan, despite her hardened exterior, couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration for Ethan. She had seen many lawyers, many experts, but none had ever spoken with such conviction, such clarity, especially someone so young. The prosecution's case was crumbling. Ethan had stripped away their arguments piece by piece, showing the gaping holes in their case with surgical precision. There was no way to deny the truth now. Judge Donovan, still processing the magnitude of what was happening, picked up the gavel and tapped it against the table to signal a short recess. As the courtroom emptied for a brief break, Ethan remained, seated, his fingers tapping gently on the table. He had done it. He had won over the judge, the prosecution, and even the spectators who had once looked at him with doubt. But there was still one last hurdle to overcome. The judge's voice cut through the quiet hum of the room as she addressed the court. "We will reconvene shortly," she said, her tone now laced with a hint of curiosity. "And Mr. Blake," she added, her eyes finally meeting his, "you've certainly earned my respect. But there's more to this case than what's on the surface. Don't think for a second that I'll go easy on you just because of your age." Ethan nodded, a small but confident smile forming on his face. "I wouldn't want it any other way, Your Honor." The break in the courtroom was brief, but it felt like an eternity to Ethan. His heart raced with anticipation, but he fought to keep his emotions in check. The judge had acknowledged his brilliance, but the real battle was far from over. The tension in the air as the court reconvened was palpable, and every eye in the room was on Ethan. This was the moment that could either solidify his victory or unravel everything he had worked so hard for. Judge Donovan returned to her seat, her expression unreadable. She gave a short nod, signaling that the proceedings were about to resume. The courtroom filled with the murmur of voices as the last few people settled into their seats. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the final confrontation. "Mr. Blake," Judge Donovan's voice rang out, steady but carrying a weight of authority. "I have listened to your arguments, and while I must admit you've certainly shaken up this courtroom, the question remains, are you truly ready for the responsibility of what you're asking? This case has serious consequences, and you as a minor have no professional background. What happens if this decision impacts your future in ways you can't predict?" Ethan stood tall, the full force of his determination now visible in his eyes. This was his moment, not just to win the case, but to prove to everyone who had ever doubted him that age did not determine wisdom, nor did it dictate the worth of his voice in the court of law. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice unwavering, "I understand the gravity of the situation, and I've thought long and hard about what I'm asking of you. But I'm not here to ask for leniency. I'm here to demand fairness. The law should not be bound by age or experience. It should be bound by the truth. And the truth is, I didn't break any law. I followed the law as it was meant to be followed." The room fell into a hushed silence once again, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The audience was captivated by the intensity in Ethan's words, his presence commanding respect despite his youth. Judge Donovan leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I appreciate your conviction, Mr. Blake, but that doesn't change the fact that you are still just a teenager. The law is not something you should take lightly, and while I understand you believe you're in the right, I can't ignore the complexity of this case. It's not as simple as you make it sound." Ethan's gaze never wavered. He had expected this. The judge had spent her entire career in the courtroom, and she was deeply entrenched in the traditions that dictated how things were supposed to work. But Ethan wasn't just any defendant. He wasn't the teenager she had assumed him to be. He was a legal genius who had spent countless hours studying the law, and now he was about to show the world just how far his intellect could take him. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice firm yet respectful, "it is exactly because of how complicated this case is that I should be allowed to argue it. I know I'm not a lawyer, but I'm capable of understanding the complexities involved, and I'm ready to fight for the truth no matter how complicated it may seem." The judge paused for a moment, considering his words. She was a seasoned professional, well-versed in reading people's motivations, but Ethan had caught her off guard in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had always prided herself on her ability to handle even the most difficult cases. But this teenager, this kid, had broken every preconceived notion she had about what a teenager was capable of. She was conflicted. The prosecutor, who had been watching with growing frustration, finally spoke up, his voice harsh and incredulous. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. We cannot let a child dictate the course of this case. He's clearly out of his depth. Let's face it, he's nothing more than a kid trying to play with the big leagues." Ethan turned his attention to the prosecutor, his eyes cold with determination. "I'm not playing," he said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "This isn't a game. This is about justice. This is about ensuring that the law is applied fairly to everyone. no matter their age, no matter their experience. And the truth is, the prosecution has failed to provide a single valid argument to support their claims. I've done my research. I've presented the facts. It's time for the truth to prevail. The words hit like a punch. The prosecutor, once brimming with arrogance, now stood silent, the weight of Ethan's challenge bearing down on him. He had no retort. The evidence was there. The arguments were solid, and he knew deep down that Ethan was right. Judge Donovan looked at the boy before her, a sense of respect dawning on her. She had seen many lawyers in her career, but none had come close to the clarity of thought, the logical precision that Ethan Blake had just displayed. He wasn't just a teenager with a good memory. He was a young man with a rare gift, one that could not be ignored. After what seemed like an eternity, Judge Donovan spoke again, her voice softer but still commanding. "Mr. Blake," she said, "I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand why you're here, or how you came to possess such an advanced understanding of the law. But what I do understand is that you are not a typical teenager. You have proven to me that you have the capacity to argue your case, and for that I respect you." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge, once dismissive and condescending, had acknowledged Ethan's brilliance. The prosecutor, now thoroughly defeated, sat back in his chair, his face a mix of disbelief and resignation. The room had shifted. The power dynamic had changed. Judge Donovan paused before delivering her final words, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "This case is far from over, Mr. Blake. There will be further proceedings, but you've made your mark today. I'll consider your arguments carefully before making a final decision, and I'll be looking forward to seeing how you continue to challenge the system, if you choose to do so." Ethan nodded, a quiet sense of triumph washing over him. He had done it. He had not only defended himself, but he had earned the respect of the court. He knew the journey was far from finished, but today he had proven that he was not just a teenager. He was a legal genius in disguise. As the courtroom emptied, the whispers began. Whispers of admiration, whispers of disbelief. Ethan Blake, the teenager who had taken on the system and emerged victorious, was a name that would be remembered for years to come. And as he walked out of the courtroom, his heart full of both excitement and relief, one thing was clear: this was just the beginning.